I spent 33 years as a structural engineer in Denver, Colorado, the kind of career that teaches you to find the one weak point in any system before it fails, the hairline crack in a beam that looks fine to an untrained eye but tells an entirely different story to someone who knows exactly where to look. At 67 years old, I used that same instinct, the one I'd spent a career sharpening on steel and concrete, to catch what my daughter's fiancé had quietly built into their prenuptial agreement, 3 weeks before their wedding. My name is Arthur Beckman. My wife, Joan, passed 5 years ago from a heart condition we caught too late, the particular cruelty of a diagnosis that comes right at the edge of being treatable rather than safely inside it. Since then it's been me and my daughter Claire, 30 years old, an architect who followed close enough behind my own career path that we've spent her entire adult life talking shop over dinner, comparing load calculations and design philosophies the way some families compare recipes. Claire met Preston Adler a little over 2 years ago, a corporate attorney at one of the larger firms downtown, sharp, well-dressed, the kind of young man who negotiates for a living and, I noticed early on, never quite fully stops doing it, even sitting across from me at a family dinner table over pot roast. I want to be fair to him in the telling of this, the way I try to be fair to everyone in stories like this one. He wasn't unkind to Claire. He was attentive in the specific way successful, busy men learn to be attentive, remembering details, asking good follow-up questions, the kind of practiced warmth that took me longer than it probably should have to distinguish from the real thing. Welcome to Revenge Confirmed. Get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. When Preston proposed, about 14 months into their relationship, he raised the subject of a prenuptial agreement almost immediately afterward, within the same week, framing it as simple professional prudence rather than any lack of romantic commitment. He was an attorney, he explained to Claire and, later, to me directly at another one of those Sunday dinners, and attorneys understand better than most people exactly how messy things can get without clear agreements established up front, precisely when two people are least inclined to think adversarially about each other. I didn't object to the concept itself. I want to be clear about that, because I know prenuptial agreements sometimes carry an unfair reputation as inherently distrustful documents, when in truth, drafted honestly, they can protect both parties equally and prevent exactly the kind of ugly disputes that tear families apart during a divorce nobody wanted in the first place. What concerned me wasn't the existence of the agreement. What concerned me was something Claire mentioned almost in passing at that same Sunday dinner, the way people mention logistical details they haven't fully thought through yet. Preston's own firm was drafting the agreement, using his firm's attorneys, and Claire, 3 months from the wedding at that point, hadn't yet arranged to have it independently reviewed by an attorney representing her interests alone. I asked her, as gently as I could manage without sounding like I doubted Preston's intentions, whether that felt right to her, having the man she was marrying effectively control both sides of a legal document meant to protect them both equally. She admitted, a little sheepishly, that she'd been putting it off, partly out of the general exhaustion of wedding planning and partly because raising the question with Preston felt, to her, like implying she didn't trust him, precisely the kind of accusation neither of them wanted hanging over an otherwise happy engagement. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. I told her, plainly, the same thing I'd tell any young engineer on a project I was overseeing. You don't skip an independent structural review because you trust the contractor. You do it because a second set of eyes, with no stake in the outcome beyond getting the facts right, catches things the first set of eyes has every reason, conscious or not, to miss. Claire heard that, and to her credit, she agreed within the week, reaching out to a family law attorney named Rosalind Chu, recommended by a colleague at her own architecture firm, specifically because Rosalind had a reputation for thoroughness rather than simply rubber stamping whatever document landed on her desk. Rosalind called me directly about a week after Claire brought her the draft agreement, which surprised me at first, until she explained that Claire had listed me as an emergency contact on some unrelated paperwork years earlier, a detail Rosalind had noticed and used, with Claire's permission, to reach out for what she called a second technical perspective, since the specific clause she'd flagged involved intellectual property and licensing language that touched directly on Claire's professional architectural work, a subject Rosalind felt someone with my own structural engineering background might read with a sharper eye than even she could bring to it alone. Buried in Section 9 of that draft agreement, labeled, almost blandly, Intellectual Property and Professional Work Product, was language stating that any architectural designs, patents, licensing agreements, or derivative commercial applications developed by either party during the course of the marriage would be considered joint marital property, co-owned equally between both spouses, regardless of which spouse had actually conceived of, developed, or executed the underlying work. I want you to understand what that clause actually meant in the specific, real circumstances of my daughter's life at that exact moment, because the timing wasn't incidental. Claire had spent the preceding 4 years developing, entirely on her own time and with her own independent research, a modular housing design specifically engineered for rapid, affordable construction in wildfire-prone areas, the kind of innovative architectural work that occasionally, if you're both skilled and fortunate, attracts serious commercial licensing interest. She was, at the point that prenuptial draft landed on Rosalind's desk, roughly 3 months away from finalizing a licensing agreement with a regional home building company, a deal that would have generated substantial ongoing royalty income tied directly and exclusively to her own individual professional achievement, work Preston had never touched, contributed to, or even fully understood the technical details of, based on every conversation I'd personally witnessed between them. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. I sat with Rosalind in her office for the better part of an afternoon, going through that full document line by line, the same methodical process I'd apply to reviewing structural drawings before signing off on a build. The clause in Section 9 wasn't accidental boilerplate language, the kind of generic catch-all phrasing that sometimes gets copied forward from template to template without careful individual attention. It was specific, deliberately worded in a way that would have captured exactly the kind of asset Claire was 3 months away from generating, with Preston's name and financial interest attached to future royalty streams from professional work he'd never actually contributed to in any meaningful sense. Rosalind, methodical in her own right, didn't stop at flagging that single clause. She recommended we review Preston's own separate financial disclosures attached to the same agreement, the section listing each party's individual premarital assets meant to remain separate property regardless of the marriage. There, buried in language considerably more technical and harder to parse at first read than Section 9 had been, we found that Preston had specifically excluded a significant, actively vesting equity stake in his own law firm's partnership track from any shared marital classification whatsoever, protecting the entire trajectory of his own future earnings completely, while the same document, drafted by his own firm, quietly claimed half of whatever Claire's independent professional work happened to generate during that same marriage. I asked Rosalind, sitting across from her that afternoon, how common a discrepancy like this actually was in her professional experience, whether this was simply the ordinary asymmetry of one side drafting a document naturally favoring their own interests or something more deliberately calculated. She considered the question carefully before answering, the way I imagine she considers most questions in her line of work. In her experience, she told me, ordinary self-interested drafting tends to be sloppy about it, favoring one side broadly without much precision about exactly which future assets matter most. This wasn't that. This was specific, targeted almost surgically at the one asset Claire was closest to realizing, drafted by someone who clearly understood, in granular detail, precisely what was coming and precisely what it would be worth. I want to be honest about what that discovery did to me sitting in Rosalind's office that afternoon. It wasn't rage, not immediately. It was the particular, cold clarity that comes from finally seeing a structure's actual load-bearing weakness after staring at surface-level blueprints that had been carefully designed to draw your eye elsewhere. Preston hadn't simply made a careless drafting error. He'd built himself a document that captured half of his fiancé's future success while shielding the entirety of his own, and he'd done it using the specific professional skill set, contract law, that made him uniquely positioned to bury exactly this kind of asymmetry in language dense enough that most people, understandably trusting the man they loved and his professional judgment, would never think to scrutinize as closely as the moment actually required. I remember sitting there thinking about every structural review I'd ever signed off on across 33 years, and how the projects that failed weren't usually the ones where the contractor was outright dishonest. They were the ones where everyone involved simply trusted the drawings a little too completely, a little too quickly, without insisting on the second look the stakes actually demanded. I called Claire that same evening, and I want to tell you honestly, I debated for a long while beforehand exactly how to approach that call, because I understood the weight of what I was about to hand her, 3 months before her wedding, about the man she'd already fully committed her future to. I decided, in the end, the same way I decided with every difficult truth I've ever had to deliver over a long career, that a partial, softened version of the facts serves nobody, least of all the person who actually has to make the decision about what to do with them. I asked her to come by my house rather than explaining everything over the phone, and she arrived within the hour, immediately sensing, the way children always seem to sense when a parent's voice carries a weight beyond its ordinary register, that whatever I needed to tell her mattered considerably more than a routine check-in. I remember watching her walk up my driveway that evening and feeling, for just a moment, the particular dread of a father about to hand his daughter something he knows will reshape how she sees a person she loves, and wishing, uselessly, that there were some gentler way through it than simply telling her the truth. I laid both documents out for her at my own kitchen table. The way I'd learned, over the course of this story and others like it, tends to be the setting where the hardest family conversations actually happen. Section 9 first, then Preston's own excluded equity disclosure, side by side, letting her read through both at her own pace rather than summarizing them for her in language that might have colored her reaction before she'd even seen the underlying facts herself. Claire read through both documents twice, the first pass quick and disbelieving, the second considerably slower, the particular slowness of someone rereading language specifically to confirm they hadn't simply misunderstood it the first time through. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady in a way that told me she'd already moved past the initial shock and into something more useful, the same clear-eyed problem-solving mode I'd watched her develop across an entire career of reviewing construction contracts and municipal building codes. "Dad," she said, "this isn't a mistake. Nobody drafts language this specific by accident, especially not someone who does this professionally for a living. He knew exactly what my licensing deal was worth, and he wrote himself half of it while making sure none of his own future counted the same way." I told her I believed she was right, and that Rosalind, an attorney with no personal stake in the outcome beyond doing her job thoroughly, had reached the same conclusion independently before either of us had ever discussed it with her. Claire didn't cancel the wedding that same week, and I want to be honest about that, because I know some of you watching might expect an immediate, dramatic rupture, the kind that makes for a cleaner story but rarely reflects how actual people process this kind of betrayal from someone they've built 2 years of real life alongside. What she did instead was ask for 2 full days before confronting Preston directly, the same kind of deliberate pause I'd watched other people in similar situations need before they could trust their own reaction enough to act on it. Those 2 days, I want to tell you, weren't quiet ones in my own house either, even though I wasn't the one directly at the center of the decision. I found myself replaying the whole discovery over and over, wondering whether I'd handled the initial conversation with Claire the right way, whether there was some gentler version of delivering that kind of news that I'd somehow failed to find. I called Rosalind once during that stretch, mostly, I think, because I needed to hear from someone with genuine professional distance that we'd done the responsible thing bringing it to Claire directly and completely, rather than trying to manage or soften what the documents actually said. She assured me, plainly, that anything less than full transparency at that stage would have been a disservice to Claire regardless of how the relationship ultimately resolved, and that reassurance mattered more to me in that moment than I expected it to. If you have been listening for a while, drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button while you're at it, and be sure you're subscribed. When those 2 days passed, Claire arranged to meet Preston at his own apartment, on a Thursday evening, and she asked me to be nearby, not present in the room itself, but close enough that she could call if the conversation went somewhere she didn't feel equipped to navigate alone. I sat in my truck 2 blocks away for the better part of 2 hours that evening, the particular helplessness of a father trusting his daughter's judgment completely while still wishing, on some instinctive level, that he could simply handle the hard part for her. She told me everything afterward, in detail, the way she's always processed difficult things, by talking them through completely rather than summarizing. She'd laid both documents on his own kitchen counter, the same way I'd laid them on mine, and asked him, directly, without accusation in her opening, to explain Section 9 in his own words, and then to explain, separately, why his own equity stake had been excluded from the same joint classification he'd applied to her future licensing income. Preston, according to Claire, tried several explanations in quick succession, the same pattern I've come to recognize across every version of this kind of story I've encountered. First, he called it standard boilerplate language his firm used across most of their prenuptial drafting work, nothing specific to Claire's circumstances at all. When Claire pointed out that standard boilerplate rarely happens to align this precisely with an asset she was 3 months from finalizing, he shifted to calling it an oversight, an unfortunate but unintentional gap in careful drafting during an unusually busy season at the firm. That explanation, too, collapsed the moment Claire asked him to explain, using the same logic, why his own equity exclusion had somehow been drafted with considerably more precision and care than the clause governing her own professional assets. He didn't have a third explanation ready, Claire told me. He just went quiet, the particular quiet of a skilled negotiator realizing, in real time, that he'd run out of room to keep managing the conversation rather than actually answering it honestly. "I'm not proud of it, Claire," he finally said, according to what she relayed to me afterward. "I told myself it was just protecting what I've built, the same way anyone protects their own career. I didn't let myself think too hard about what it actually meant for you specifically, because I think some part of me knew exactly what it meant, and didn't want to face that part directly. I want to be fair to Preston in the telling of this, the same way I've tried to be fair to every difficult person in every version of this story I've ever shared. I don't believe, based on everything Claire relayed to me afterward, that he set out from the very beginning of their relationship with some grand, calculated plan to defraud the woman he loved. I believe, more plausibly, that a genuine, gradual insecurity about his own career trajectory, sitting beside a partner whose independent professional success was quietly beginning to outpace his own in certain visible ways, had curdled slowly into a decision he could rationalize to himself as reasonable self-protection, right up until the moment my daughter laid the actual language in front of him and asked him to defend it directly, out loud, without the comfortable distance of legal terminology to hide behind. Claire didn't end the relationship that night either, and I want to walk you through why, because I think her reasoning matters considerably more than a simple binary decision to stay or leave. She told Preston, plainly, that she wasn't prepared to sign any version of that agreement, and that if he genuinely wanted to move forward with the wedding, the entire document would need to be redrafted from scratch, this time by her own independent attorney rather than his firm, with fully equal, mutually reviewed protections on both sides, and full transparency about every asset either of them brought into or expected to generate during the marriage. Preston agreed, considerably more chastened than I think he'd ever been in any negotiation of his professional career, and the wedding, originally scheduled for late spring, was postponed by 4 months while Rosalind, working directly with Claire this time and with a separate attorney representing Preston's interests independently from his own firm, built an entirely new agreement from the ground up. I want to tell you what that renegotiated agreement actually contained, because I think the specifics matter to anyone watching who might find themselves in a similar situation someday. Both parties' premarital assets remained fully separate, symmetrically, with no exceptions carved out favoring either side. Any professional intellectual property, patents, licensing income, or derivative commercial work generated by either spouse individually during the marriage remained that spouse's separate property, unless both parties explicitly, jointly contributed to its development, in which case a specific, negotiated shared percentage applied, documented and agreed upon case by case rather than assumed wholesale by default. It was, by any honest measure, a considerably fairer document than the original draft had ever been, and Rosalind told me privately afterward that she found the final version to be about as balanced and mutually protective as any prenuptial agreement she'd worked on in her considerable career, the kind of document, she said, that actually does what these agreements are supposed to do in the first place, protect both people equally rather than quietly favoring whoever happened to control the pen. Claire and Preston married 4 months later than originally planned, in a smaller ceremony than they'd first envisioned, partly due to the delay itself and partly, I suspect, because both of them approached the actual day with a more grounded, less performative understanding of what they were actually building together than they might have carried into the original wedding date, before any of this had surfaced. I didn't attend that wedding with any lingering resentment toward Preston, which I know might surprise some of you watching. I attended it because Claire, having seen the worst version of what her fiancé was capable of quietly building, and having confronted it directly, decisively, and gotten a genuine, corrected response rather than continued deflection, made her own informed decision about whether that relationship was still worth building a life inside. That decision belonged entirely to her, and I respected it completely, the same way I'd respected her right to sign the original flawed document if she'd somehow chosen that path instead. Claire's licensing deal on that modular wildfire-resistant housing design closed about 6 weeks after the wedding, under her name alone, with the full royalty structure protected exactly the way the renegotiated agreement guaranteed it would be. It's become, in the 2 years since, a considerably larger commercial success than even she'd originally projected, licensed now across 4 different regional home building companies, the kind of quiet, sustained professional achievement that speaks for itself far more persuasively than any argument I could have made on her behalf at that kitchen table where this whole story actually started. I asked Claire once, about a year after the wedding, sitting at that same kitchen table where I'd first shown her both documents, whether she ever thought about what might have happened if Rosalind hadn't happened to call me directly, if that clause in Section 9 had simply slipped past her the way it was clearly designed to. "I think about it more than I'd like to, Dad," she told me honestly. "I think I would have signed it. I trusted him completely, and I was tired, and it would have been so easy to just sign what his firm handed me and move on to worrying about flowers and seating charts instead. I don't know if I'd have ever actually caught it myself, not until it mattered in a divorce someday, which is exactly the point of a document like that existing in the first place, isn't it? It's not meant to be caught early. It's meant to sit quietly until the moment it's actually needed against you. I still keep a copy of that original draft agreement in my own filing cabinet, Section 9 highlighted in the same yellow marker Rosalind used the afternoon she first walked me through it. Not out of lingering anger toward Preston, who I've genuinely come to respect over these past 2 years watching him make real, sustained effort to be a considerably more transparent partner than that first document ever suggested he intended to be. I keep it as a reminder of something I learned late in my own career and apparently needed to relearn, personally, watching my own daughter nearly sign it away. The weak point in any structure is rarely the part everyone's already looking at carefully. It's the clause, the joint, the beam nobody thought needed a second, independent set of eyes, precisely because the person who built it seemed too trustworthy, too competent, too clearly in love, to ever need checking. There's more to this story I want to share with you, because I think it matters just as much as the confrontation itself, maybe more. About 8 months after the wedding, Preston asked to meet me alone, without Claire, at a coffee shop near my house, which surprised me enough that I almost asked him to explain the reason over the phone before agreeing. He didn't, and I decided, out of some combination of curiosity and the same instinct that's guided most of my important decisions over the years, to simply show up and hear him out directly. He arrived early, already seated when I got there, and he didn't waste time working up to whatever he'd actually come to say, which I respected, even before I understood the substance of it. "Arthur," he said, "I've thought about how to say this for a long time, and I don't think there's a version that doesn't just sound like an apology I'm required to make rather than one I actually mean, so I'm going to try to explain the thinking instead, and let you decide whether that's worth anything." He told me, over the following half hour, something considerably more honest than I'd expected walking in. He'd grown up, he explained, in a family where his own father had lost almost everything in a divorce during Preston's teenage years, a protracted, ugly legal battle that had eaten through his father's law practice and left, by Preston's account, a lasting impression on him about exactly how vulnerable a person's professional life could become the moment a marriage went wrong. He'd carried that fear, largely unexamined, into his own relationship with Claire, and when the moment came to draft a prenuptial agreement, he told me, some part of him had reached for the same instinct his own father's experience had taught him: protect everything you can, as thoroughly as you can, before anyone else has the chance to take it from you the way it was taken from your family once before. "I'm not telling you that to excuse it," he said, watching me carefully across that small coffee shop table. I know exactly what that clause would have meant for Claire if she'd signed it without catching it, and I know I used my own professional skill specifically to make it harder to catch. I just want you to understand it came from somewhere real, even if what I did with it wasn't. I sat with that for a long moment before I answered him, the same deliberate pause I've learned matters in almost every difficult conversation I've ever had. I told him, honestly, that understanding where a mistake comes from doesn't erase the mistake itself, but that it does, in my experience, tell you something important about whether a person is likely to make the same mistake again, once they've actually had to sit with the consequences of it directly. I told him what mattered far more to me than anything he'd said that afternoon was what I'd watched him actually do in the 8 months since Claire confronted him, the fully renegotiated agreement, the transparency he'd maintained since, the way Claire herself had described him showing up differently in the smaller, daily decisions of their marriage since that difficult Thursday evening conversation at his own kitchen counter. Preston nodded slowly at that, and I think, looking back on that conversation now, it was the moment I actually let go of whatever residual wariness I'd still been carrying toward him since the day Rosalind first called me about Section 9. Not because he'd earned some instant, complete forgiveness through a single honest conversation over coffee, but because he'd shown me, through sustained, consistent behavior over real time, the exact thing his own explanation had been missing in the moment Claire first confronted him, a willingness to sit with the actual weight of what he'd done rather than simply managing his way through the discomfort of being caught. Claire and I talk about all of this occasionally now, usually at that same kitchen table where the whole story first unfolded for both of us. She told me, a few months ago, that she started, in her own architecture practice, insisting on independent legal review for every significant contract she signs, not just personal agreements but professional ones too, licensing deals, partnership agreements, construction contracts with clients who seem, on the surface, entirely trustworthy. She's built it into her standard process now, the same way I built structural peer review into every project I ever oversaw across 33 years, not because she assumes bad faith from everyone she works with, but because she's learned, the hard way, that even good people, under enough pressure or fear, can build something they'd never have consciously chosen to build if they'd let themselves look at it directly. I think about that lesson more than almost anything else from this whole experience, more even than the specific satisfaction of having caught that clause before it cost my daughter something she'd spent 4 years earning entirely on her own. The real lesson, the one I hope she carries forward for the rest of her career, isn't really about Preston specifically, or even about prenuptial agreements narrowly. It's about the particular discipline of reading everything yourself, completely, even when, especially when, the person handing you the document is someone you love and trust more than almost anyone else in your life. Trust and verification were never actually in tension with each other, not in engineering and, as it turns out, not in marriage either. The buildings that stand the longest aren't the ones built on blind faith in the contractor's word. They're the ones where someone, at every critical stage, insisted on checking the math themselves, precisely because the stakes were too important to leave entirely in someone else's hands, no matter how much you loved and trusted the person holding them. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you for being a part of Revenge Confirmed.